Call of Duty Zombies is a difficult game, from hard to learn Easter eggs to a gameplay loop that can be punishing to learn but rewarding to master. At the end of every modern main quest, however, there is a boss fight, with boss fights in Zombies memorable for their thematics and gameplay mechanics rather than the way the fight tests skills players have learned on the map. Then it got me thinking, is it possible to beat these encounters just by yourself, and without taking it down? A challenge undertaken by very few, as the games are designed with co-op in mind. Well, hello there, fellow zombie slayers! My name is Stanley557. Come join me as we defeat every single solo boss fight in Call of Duty Zombies. Which ones are the most difficult, which ones are the most engaging, and which ones just throw in the towel? Well, let's find out. As we talk about each boss fight, we're also going to be ranking and discussing them. I'm going to be looking at 3 specific categories. 1. Thematics. How the boss fight enhances the standard gameplay of Zombies, with unique music, visuals, and themings. 2. Gameplay. The way the boss itself interacts with the player, and the mechanics that the fight introduces. And 3. How well the standard undead are incorporated into the fight. Do the regular zombies naturally flow into the battle, or are they more lethal than the boss itself? Well, let's go through every map one by one, and rank them all at the end just to keep things more interesting. Descent is the first official Call of Duty Zombies boss fight. Well, the first Zombies one, with Extinction's Breeder and Kraken on Nightfall and Mayday respectively coming beforehand. I'm not playing Extinction in solo, and technically it's not Zombies, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring them up first. They're a lot of fun, with the Kraken specifically having a ton of spectacle, and the Breeder itself being really well animated, and having a ton of unique attacks. But let's talk about Zombies now. In Exo Zombies' final experience, players are pitted against the undead brute known as Oz, a boss you'll encounter by reaching round 20 rather than completing the main quest, which is an immediate bonus and shows the developers were really proud of the fight and wanted as many players as possible to complete it. Oz is completely immune to damage unless players activate 4 generators around the arena to power a decontamination pad. By activating the pad with Oz nearby, players can damage the brute. This process repeats 4 times, with each phase split by each fourth of the boss's health bar. Oz can give players the infection debuff by coming into contact with them, launch EMP shockwaves that disable the exosuit, deal massive damage if you get too close and are already infected, and activate various traps like an EMP grid that prevents you from using your exosuit, poison gas clouds that block off specific parts of the arena and infect you if you get too close, and electric floors that do nothing because they're never where you need them to be. The boss isn't exactly all that flashy, and serves to deliver a gameplay experience rather than a cinematic one, which I appreciate first and foremost. A fight is only as fun as actually playing it. Then there's the zombies themselves. What's really cool is that the fight slowly introduces the undead into the arena, with each phase reintroducing stronger special enemies like the EMZs, Blinkers, Spikers, and Fuse Zombies just to name a few. But for the first boss fight in Zombies, it's nice to have a dynamic special enemy that isn't instantly destroyed, but also one that doesn't completely overwhelm an experienced player. And if you're playing with a team, it's an absolute blast. As for the solo experience, it's best to keep away from Oz and bring distraction zones with you. But for overall difficulty, it's really easy, and any good player should be able to beat it with no trouble, especially without going down. But if you play your cards right and keep a level head, you'll make it out just fine.
Save it for the right time.
Black Ops 3 is an interesting case of a game, because you immediately lose all of your perks upon downing, and with said down more or less resulting in an immediate loss. You'll pretty much have to play each of these boss fights to perfection to beat them anyways, or you could choose Mega Gobblegums, but you'll rarely see consumables used in this video, so keep that in mind when we discuss this game's boss fights. Starting out with the first Treyarch boss fight, the Shadowman makes an appearance at the end of the Shadows of Evil solo main quest, with the step being followed up by the Gateworm attack in co-op only. For their first outing, I was always disappointed with this fight. Despite taking place in a cool location, the fight goes one of 2 ways. Either it's over in 12 seconds, or it takes 12 years. There's really no middle ground, and that's my primary frustration with the fight. It doesn't exactly feel that well balanced. The Shadowman is defeated by activating the various keepers around the room, and shooting him onto the altar table where he can be captured within the summoning key. A cool concept, if the Shadow Man actually interacted with the player. For the supreme overlord of the Apothicons, the Shadow Man has wicked abilities like floating there, and summoning a barrier, and summoning a Margwa, and disabling any active keepers, meaning they'll have to be activated again, which takes just a few seconds if you're coordinated, and that's it. There's not a whole lot of nuance to the fight, which is a real shame. Shadows of Evil feels like it was building towards a climactic duel. And sure, the last step is that conclusion, but it's weird that the two steps aren't just thrown together somehow. It's also possible the team was gauging what they could and couldn't do. Then there's the thematics, which I actually really do like. The Pack-a-Punch Arena is always a cool location. It's truly otherworldly, although the music is completely out of place for what the rest of the map's OST offers. And it feels more like we're getting ready to put the Shadow Man into a nursing home, rather than saving the universe from cosmic terrors as people grapple with their sins. And finally, there's the zombies themselves, which feel way more dangerous than the boss, which is fitting considering that the Shadow Man cannot actually directly attack you. In solo, the fight is nothing more than an accuracy test. And if you know me, then you know that there's nothing more difficult in zombies than having good aim. It's not at all dynamic, and the Shadow Man might as well A-pose as he teleports around the arena, which he basically does anyways. And if you use a death machine, it's not even a competition. Going, believe it or not, below Oz. All style, no substance.
Winning streak.
Here it is, the first official Treyarch boss fight that feels like an actual boss fight. We've had a lot of firsts to get here, so let's talk about the Corrupted Keeper. Drak pits the Primus crew against the allies of Group 935. To defeat their foe, they must summon a Ghost Warrior, fill him with charged energy, teleport him to the moon, have him steal an evil space pyramid, all in the effort to open a cryopod that has a Bluetooth electric field around it. Well, if you ask me, that's just par for the course around here. The Corrupted Keeper is a fun boss fight. It can unleash flame pillars that damage you over time, shoot skulls that track and damage you, and at specific times, he'll unleash an AoE insta-kill attack that must be intercepted in order to start doing damage. If his shockwave isn't interrupted, you'll be instantly murdered if you aren't hiding behind a pillar, which isn't indicated to players at all, and comes off as completely unfair, which was intentional by Jason Blundell. And if you've ever played a good video game, you know that's stupid. I think an easy workaround would be having the attack do little damage the first time it's used, and only on the final phase of the fight would it insta-kill you. This shows players what it can do, and by the third phase, you should know how to counter it. And if that's not enough, have the lightning turn red, indicating it's gotten stronger for its final attack. But if we ignore that attack, it's a roaming enemy that has distinct points when it can and cannot be damaged, and its attacks naturally complements both the movement and undead systems. You're constantly on the move, and the undead will slowly filter behind you if left unchecked, but it can be easily dealt with due to the nature of the bows themselves. But the more the undead you leave behind, the more risk you put yourself at if one of the keeper's attacks disrupts your movement. There's some great synergy between the two groups, and if it wasn't for how unfair the insta-kill attack was, I'd say this would be one of the best boss fights in the series, especially for first-time players. But going back on that, I like how the specialist weapon is integrated into the fight. Sure, it's nothing more than a tool, but it's cool to see equipment and aspects of the map integrated into the boss fight, something we'll rarely see going forward. Then there's the boss's thematics. Where is this arena? To access the fight, you need to use the DG4 to teleport you, the Keeper, and the MPD to somewhere. And it's not like the arena doesn't exist, because panzers can fly into it too. So is this a nest nearby the castle? Because it has stone dragon pillars, which are a key piece of iconography on the base. Well, wherever it is, it loses points for it not naturally being connected to the map, which was most likely done to save time. Once damaged, the Keeper will temporarily teleport away, and you're forced to face off with 3 tanky panzers, and with 8 spawning in co-op. These panzers are nothing more than a time waster. They have much higher health than their standard counterpart, and due to the open nature of the arena, their abilities are only at their advantage. What I dislike most about this is that the panzers are used perfectly in the co-op version of Phase 3. During this portion of the boss fight, players are interrupted by a single panzer spawning in. If not taken down, the beast can easily disrupt gameplay and get you killed by the Keeper's insta-kill attack. This synergizes perfectly with my suggestion earlier of making the AoE attack an insta-kill only in the 3rd phase. By that point, you should know how to counter it, and the Panzer should be the factor that shakes things up. But this is a solo tier list after all, so who cares about that? In solo, the fight is quite easy, with the only real troubles being the Panzers that show up between phases 1 and 2, and 2 and 3. And if you take your time, there's hardly any risk of failure. And honestly, most players do this fight downless without even thinking about it. The best one we've had so far. Now, this is going to be a 2-part review, because I'd like to rank both the Spider Queen and the King Thrasher separately. So let's talk about the Spider Queen first. Taking place around the halfway point through the quest, players must enter the Spider Queen's domain in order to collect a part needed to upgrade the KT-4. Let's start off first with the way this arena looks. This is a gorgeous boss fight arena. Setsubo is always at its best when it goes for its moody neon blues and harsh bright lighting. Players are separated from the spider by a gap in the floor, but even with that, it still manages to cover the entire arena within its grasp, showing to you, the player, how little room you have to work with, unlike the other massive bosses that can be found in the series. The Spider Queen can use its long legs to impale players, spit out acid that can slowly kill you if you aren't careful, and summon spider reinforcements from the nest on its back. If unprepared, these attacks can pair quite nicely together. There are no undead that spawn in while you fight her, making the Spider Queen your primary focus. The only issue I have with the fight is how short it is. It's probably already ended in the background of this footage, but it can easily be taken down by just about any full auto PAP weapon with double tap. But sometimes a fight that's short and sweet is infinitely better than one that goes on forever. And after enough damage is done, she's killed by a cave-in that perfectly fills in the gap, allowing you to cross. As is required for completion of the egg, there is no threat of downing for this video, going below the keeper but above the rest.
Fortune rewards those who look out for it.
Then there's the Thrasher King, or just overgrown Takio. But it's cool to call him the Thrasher King, because you have this Queen Spider, it's like a little theme. The Thrasher King is the exact opposite of the Spider Queen. An immovable wall that has a single attack that can be easily avoided if you have eyes and ears. The most dangerous part of this fight is the cramped arena, and the constantly spawning undead Thrashers and Spiders, which is already never a good sign. The Thrasher King attacks players by swinging down in front of him with his long tendril. This is an insta-kill if you're directly hit by it, but it takes so long to actually activate and takes up so little of the arena, it's not even a threat. You can literally beat the entire thing by simply training for 4 minutes. And as long as you're careful, this works, and the boss is defeated before it even has a chance to get going. It also doesn't help that if you prioritize the top tendrils when they appear, it doesn't even have an attack during the final phase. The only silver lining being the outstanding camping spot granted to you once the fight is over, and of course the well-written final cutscene between Takio and Takio. Easy to complete without going down. What a mess. Going just above the Shadow Man, but not by much. Alright, so unlike what I did with the two Setsubo bosses, I'm going to be classifying the Dragon and Nikolai boss fights as the same encounter. Unlike the Spider and Thrasher fights, these two boss fights take place one after the other, whereas the two Setsubo fights are two completely separate encounters. And hey, if you don't like this tier list, why don't you make your own? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So let's get into it. The arena is great, and I love how it changes and opens up once the dragon is defeated. A cool underrated feature that helps you fight Nikolai, as it gives you a ton of hiding spots, and the space is wide enough that the various enemies and undead can be easily trained, giving you the needed breathing room that would otherwise make the undead too overly oppressive. Something many other boss fights in this series would absolutely benefit from. Enemies like the Mangler also synergize with this open philosophy, as their attacks take much longer to reach you, while still making them a ranged threat that can easily pick you off if you aren't careful. Then there's the cool little oddities like the unexplained mannequin Easter egg, and the Ace of Spades Easter egg, which can both be seen and accessed during the fight's second phase. So let's talk about the bosses themselves. The dragon is a flying behemoth that must be taken down with the help of Nikolai and his futuristic mech that's just never explained. Amazing synergy with the world building and premise. You see the mech suit in the intro, and you say to yourself, there's no way they'll ever let us actually fight alongside this thing, or fight it, right? And they actually do! God, this boss fight is so cool. The dragon goes through various phases of burning the arena, and can only be attacked once Nikolai's 1-5 induced spears punctures its hide, revealing a weak point that the Mark IIIs absolutely melt. What I love about the fire is that you, the player, already know it can be avoided by using the shield, which is great synergy with an in-map mechanic. But if you lose the shield, the map is big enough that you can fight your way through the undead until it ends. And this is further backed up by the dragon wings, which grant you damage reduction to the fire. The dragon will also launch fireballs akin to the G-strikes, though I've never really had an issue with them. Once defeated, the dragon blows up. That's awesome! And you'll move on to the second phase, Nikolai. This drunken titan can gun you down, launch raps from the campaign that can damage you, and shoot his 1-5 spears to temporarily stun you. This is where the terrain comes in handy, and if you're smart, you'll make it out of the fight unharmed. The dragon has very little chance to down you, and Nikolai is a lethal threat, but as stated before, if you use the terrain or in plain sight, the fight will be over before you know it. Now, there is a glitch where if you enter the boss fight without quick revive, Nikolai will instantly kill you, but we don't talk about that. From thematics, to gameplay, to all above those little details, this is one of the best boss fights in the series, going above the Keeper. Now that we're at Revelations, let's talk about repeat boss fights. Repeating a boss fight already sets you back a few points, especially if you don't do anything unique with said boss fight. But thankfully Revelations is reusing the Shadowman boss fight, so it's pretty easy to build upon practically nothing. But once again, the Shadowman does nothing. Supreme Overlord of Evil doesn't even know how to do anything other than sit in a bubble until it breaks, then just floats there. What a guy! Now, let's go over what this fight does differently compared to the original. Unlike the Shadows fight, players must charge a summoning key and throw it into Sophia, who uses the energy to pierce the Shadowman's shield. Then it's the same process as last time, just with the Shadowman teleporting to areas closer than before, making them even easier for people like me. Included in the roster this time are Panzers, Elemental Margwas, the Apothicans, the Furies, and of course the Undead. If the fight goes on too long, you'll eventually have to do combat with the elemental effects from the Margwa fights as well. In solo, this fight can be tricky as there's nothing defending you besides the little Arnies, but those can be destroyed by the Panzer and the Margwa if they aren't properly dealt with. Just like the spider fight, this one is probably already over in the background before I even finish talking about it. It's very easy to go down due to the high power threats, so finishing as fast as possible is a must. A lackluster boss fight, a repeated one for that matter, but one that's just barely going above the original because there wasn't really a whole lot to the first one in the first place. Now, unlike BO3, the IW boss fights are where things get difficult. This game has poor AI collision, few defensive options, and special enemies that do high damage. So this is where the real challenge begins. For the first questline in IW, Zombies in Spaceland ends up being a really fun time that values difficult, undead killing action over puzzles, which is something that cannot be said for the DLC. Now, with Spaceland, I was wondering whether or not to include the UFO in this boss fight tier list, as it's technically not the boss fight, but the sequence is started with it, so I'll include it anyways. The beginning of the boss fight is a short game, as Simon says, with the UFO indicating which colors need to be pressed. Do it right 3 times, and you'll move on to the next phase. If you fail, you'll have to take down a Spaceland Brute to proceed. Once completed, you'll be rushed by waves of clowns. And after that, you can finally do battle with the actual aliens. In solo, this boss fight is nothing more than a fencing match, although the undead poorly synergize with his moves and abilities. The alien can teleport, stun players with high damage pistol shots, raise undead to defend him, and punch players should they get too close. Each of these attacks deal a ton of damage, and due to the aggressive nature of the AI and the few defensive options that you have, it's very easy to take an immediate and sudden down, which further promotes you to train around the arena in a slow fashion, only getting in hits when it's most desirable to do so. Something else I also don't like is damaging him. If you fail to melee a fuse on his backpack when he goes down, you'll have to redo that phase all over again, which is stupid. And then there's the arena itself. Using the spawn area to its biggest advantage, you have a ton of space to move around and freely corral the horde. And for thematics, there's no unique tracks that accompany the fight. In fact, there's no music at all, which is something you don't even think about until the music returns. But the fight makes up for it with pure gameplay that challenges players, even if the zombies are probably the worst part about it. I've been taken down by this fight many times, and even while going for the recording, there were at least 3 close calls just trying to finish it. This fight is tough as nails, for all the wrong reasons. Going underneath the Spider Queen, fun but bogged down by what makes IW, IW.
Cut! 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 Ah! You're ruining this film! Why won't you just die at you already?
Rave in the Redwoods has players face off against the Super Slasher, Kevin Smith's true form. The boss fight is probably the best in IW due to its balance, fun factor, and overall low difficulty. Something I want to immediately point out is its visuals, and the use of the Rave mode color palette swap, which is always a bonus to see map features incorporated. To defeat the boss, players will have to charge soul boxes that weaken his demonic barrier. Once done, you must shoot a variety of symbols on his chest. Repeat this 3 times, survive 2 acidic storms, and you'll be done before you know it, condemning Kevin Smith to hell. This boss fight is relatively easy in comparison to something like Spaceland, and this is helped due to the mostly destructive power of the crossbows, which gets some good mileage here due to the undead having high health bars, and the soul boxes needing to be filled up quickly should they need to be recharged if you take too long. The Super Slasher comes with numerous attacks that all fall on the very weak side. He can slam down on the ground in front of him, leap across the arena in a single bound to deal damage, produce a shockwave that can easily be dodged, and I'm 95% sure it just doesn't do anything, and when in between phases, will produce insta-kill buzzsaws that are also no threat as they're only up until he reaches the lodge. And the arena itself is not that big, so they're not even on the field for that long. When also in between phases, the Super Slasher will summon deadly acidic winds, which can be avoided by hiding behind a rock. Then there's the undead themselves, which are arguably more deadly than the boss, but they're not really much of an issue due to how big the arena is and how good the bows are against them. But once you defeated the symbols on his body for a 3rd time, the boss can be finally attacked, and is defeated almost instantly due to double tap and the power of IW's double tap. An extremely simple boss fight that ranks higher than most for being fun, and it helps that the most of it takes place in the Rave Vision as well. Going down is a threat, but that's due to the IW mechanics and not the boss itself. Take your time, and don't crack under the pressure. Going, believe it or not, above the Keeper. Shaolin Shuffle has players take on Arthur McIntosh, the Rat King. A weird boss fight that has players switch between actually attacking the boss and completing minigames that test different skills, with the Rat King himself switching between his abilities depending on what phase you're currently on. The Rat King can raise his shield to defend himself, shoot a shockwave of debris like the Super Slasher, and just like it I'm pretty sure his collision does nothing, summon a small horde of super ninjas, and throw his shield like Captain America and have it rebound off the wall. Just like the Super Slasher, the Rat King himself is quite weak, with the undead and the terrible collision doing more work than him. Just some terrible synergy if you ask me. Then there's the challenges themselves. Players have to defeat a zombie in acid pools around the arena before time runs out, shoot all the hidden symbols that periodically show up before the time runs out, and wait for the undead to eat the Rat King's brain. Once all 3 of these challenges are completed, you can face off with the Rat King one more time, and put a bullet through his head. Unlike Rave, where I feel like you're constantly attacking the boss and putting your efforts into breaking his barrier by filling up the soul jars, in Shaolin the boss fight is constantly interrupted by being forced to complete random challenges that hardly feel as though they pertain to features the map has to offer, and presented during the Easter egg. You don't use the chi abilities at all, and it's a shame that they aren't incorporated in the slightest besides breaking open perk boxes, which doesn't matter as we can't go down for this video anyways. And to add insult to injury, these boxes can also be broken by the Rat King throwing his shield. And on top of all of that, you're only awarded max ammos after completing each minigame. So if you run out of ammo trying to complete one of these minigames like the eye or heart puzzle, which repeat if you run out of time, then you are soft locked with no way to progress through the fight. Which is stupid. Then there's the thematics. The fight has no unique theme, but fighting undead alongside Pam Grier is really cool, and elevates the fight higher than I'm making it sound. But in terms of fun, this boss fight is a hodgepodge of ideas, and is all over the place in terms of quality. In the boss fight, you're always at risk of going down, whether it be by the ninjas that show up accompanying the Rat King, the acid pool step, or even just the AI collision. This fight has had me pulling my hair out, and getting footage for this one was seemingly difficult for no reason. And it didn't help that if I failed, I would have to redo the entirety of this lengthy Easter egg. Going below the aliens from Spaceland.
Thank you, my young apprentices.
Now, let's talk about Attack of the Radioactive Thing. Specifically, the lovely Krogzilla. Now, much of this will be repeated from the upcoming or possibly already released Attack re-review. Which, by the way, you should go watch if you haven't already, and also including my re-reviews of Spaceland Rape and Shaolin. Much like Shaolin's boss fight, Attack has players partake in gimmicks and mini-games instead of actually fighting the boss. But thankfully, unlike Shaolin, the steps you have to perform to complete the Easter egg feel as though they coincide with the actual egg, all being part of a flowing narrative. Escort the bomb gets eaten, try to neutralize Krogzilla using the flat cannons on the beach, go through a final resort, and activate the bomb from within. Activate the bomb and escape at the last second. I always go back and forth with this concept, but after talking about Shaolin, I appreciate the story it tries to tell. Then there's the fight itself. When you escort the bomb, you are constantly bombarded by Krogzilla and rushed at by undead. In solo, this creates an inconsistent synergy with the undead, which leads to the step being sluggish and unsatisfying to play, unlike the last step at the end of this boss fight. Then there's the flat cannon step, which has a nice rhythm, as in solo, you're given a reprieve from undead every 2 waves, which gives you a chance to actually damage Krogzilla, and the step is probably the best time to make use of the map's buildables, if you decide to carry any in with you. Probably the best part of the boss fight because you're actually engaging with Krogzilla, who fires laser beams and slams to the ground to try and take you down. For what it's worth, it's actually a lot of fun to fight, which you would think would seem difficult for a beast this large. Then there's the final step. Once Krogzilla shimmies, you can interact with the bomb to initiate a teleport sequence, but you're prevented from getting close by Krogzilla spewing acid. Now in the final step, you must endure the onslaught of the undead until the acid disappears. And there's surprisingly good synergy between the undead and Krogzilla launches. After enough time passes, you must now avoid lasers as you make your way to the front of the beach. And these lasers usually aren't too bad, but sometimes they'll just kill you by touching your pinky toe, and that's just not fun. But teleport within, activate the bomb, and cause a craptastic explosion. Then there's the thematics, which there aren't really any as the fight has no unique music or themings, which is a real shame. Some cheesy orchestral music would have gone a long way, like an extended version of the Kroground theme. Then there's the fight's consistency, which is all over the place despite everything having a narrative through line. Just like Shaolin and Spaceland, this fight was difficult to complete in solo without going down. Which is weird because I've done it a ton of times before, but when re-recording the footage for this video, I apparently just couldn't do it right, usually running into issues with the laser minigame for some reason. Going below the aliens, but above the Rat King. And here we are, the Cryptid Assault from Beast from Beyond. Often considered one of the worst fights in the series, and psst, spoilers, those people are correct. The Cryptid Assault is an absolute mess, so let's break it down. The fight is split between 6 distinct phases. There's the initial Mammoth introduction, the first Cryptid wave which involves just scouts, the second wave which reintroduces phantoms, the third wave which forces you to survive until you can shut down the portals, also with a rhino introduced into the mix, the fourth, which is a 3-minute survival sequence where you have to wait for a new computer to finish charging, and the final phase is a fight between 2 mammoths who spew out blue flames upon being damaged. This boss fight is an absolute mess. Poor collision, poor enemy balancing, and no defensive options. An overwhelming foe that hardly synergizes not only with the boss, but with the player's toolset, and it just goes on and on. Even with the best strategies and setups, your odds of success are quite inconsistent. And that's in solo, where I'd say it's the easiest because you only have to worry about yourself. Trust me, this fight has it all. And what's even worse, there's not even a rockin' tune to jam out to while you die. If there's any silver lining this fight has that's going for it is that if you go down, you can grab the 5 core perks, which periodically respawn for players. But we can't down for the sake of this video, so that silver lining is useless. And it helps if you have the EVR Bomber variant, and the Ego Trip Fate and Fortune card, which you can finish the final phase in seconds. But that requires weekly grinding, which isn't fun. I've grinded this fight plenty of times trying to be Mephistopheles downless, so I pretty much have it down at this point. But completing this quest initially for the original IW review was a nightmare, and easily the most difficult boss to do solo without going down. Going at the bottom, I don't need to say anything else about it.
You've done it! My goodness, you've finally done it!
Then there's Mephistopheles. And if you thought fights couldn't get any worse than the cryptids, you'd be correct. In fact, Mephistopheles is arguably the best boss fight in the entirety of zombies. What a dichotomy. Let's talk about it. For starters, this is one of the few fights to understand the balance between both undead and bosses versus players, which is weird considering Beast failed at this spectacularly. Let's dig deeper. For starters, undead spawn in extremely small numbers, besides the final phase. This makes it easy for players to focus on the extremely lethal boss, while still making them a small threat, lose track of them, and they can be the difference between life and death. Then there's Mephistopheles himself. Unlike other boss fights, Mephistopheles has tells in both his animations and audio cues, making it possible for players to discern what he's doing even if you have your back to him. This attention to detail is vital for beating the boss fight. Each phase requires players to stand atop various ritual circles and charge them by waiting on them, killing undead that get closer, and avoid the lethal attacks Mephistopheles unleashes to try and get you off of them. Once charged, you have to use the Entangler to shoot doomed souls at him to weaken him. One shot at it enough, you can damage one of the 5 sigils on his chest. After that, you'll have to survive an intermediary phase, which involves the various special enemies from the season, and then finally a meteor onslaught. This must be repeated 5 times. As each phase progresses, Mephistopheles gains new attacks you'll have to learn, with phases 2 through 4 switching up which new attack he learns every time you retry the fight. Mephistopheles fires lethal volume meteors, summons undead, shoots a line of fire across the battlefield, summons a black hole to suck you in, throws a large meteor at the battlefield, divides the battlefield in half with a lethal wall of flames, performs a grand slam that can down you if you're too close, and summon a flaming tornado that shoots out in 6 different directions at phase 5. Each of these attacks usually have long charge up times and are made to always keep you on your toes as Mephistopheles flies around players. After the 5th phase, the boss can finally be damaged, but this comes at the added detriment of a speed up in his attacks and special enemies constantly spawning in. This is where the boss fight kicks it to 11. And if you haven't gone down yet, you better finish quickly, or else you'll be taken out trying to take down the mammoth that can spawn in if you take too long. Then there's the gorgeous skybox, the awesome music which is copyrighted, and the zombies being skeletons. A cool feature I forgot to mention also happens in DE. And while the fight is long, it can be practiced in the game's boss fight mode, which gives you an easy opportunity to give it a go before you attempt the real deal, which only happens after the beast boss fight, so practice makes perfect. As for doing this without going down, don't even get me started. If I remember correctly, it took me around 12 hours of practice in the game's boss fight mode to consistently defeat him, and then a few more hours of trying to defeat him without going down in the actual boss fight that takes place once you beat Beast from Beyond in Director's Cut. And believe me, there would be attempts where I would beat Beast, get the correct weapons from Mystery Wheel, and then immediately go down. Not the most fun boss to practice for this video, but it is now an eternal trophy I wear with pride. Difficulty is the name of the game, but it's one of the few to do it right. Mephistopheles might be one of the best boss fights in the series, going at the top. World War II Zombies is a game I have such a sweet spot for, but most of these bosses were not designed with solo players in mind. And because you don't lose perks, and always spawn in with 2 additional self-revives, you're expected to go down, which made getting footage for this game even harder than it was in IW. So let's talk about it. In the hardcore version of the boss fight, the Panzer Mortar is a slightly more threatening foe than his casual counterpart. He can constantly take away armor, and that's honestly the biggest threat that he provides. Players are tasked with dislodging bombs from an enemy Zeppelin, charge the batteries inside, and attach them to the Panzer Mortar when they are ready. Repeat this 3 times, wait through 2 intermissions, and the fight's over. I like the thematics, but like IW, there's sadly no unique tracks for the boss fight. It honestly would have benefited from a haunting overture, even if the art style is some of the series' best. Then there's my issues with the fight. Due to the way the arena is designed, you're pretty much training the boss in a circle around the town, with the Panzer Mortar being nothing but a wall that pushes you along the path that you're on. This makes the fight feel slow. You're basically waiting for the opportunity to shoot the Zeppelin, charge the batteries, and for the opportunity to down the boss so you can attach the bombs to him. And if that's not enough, the intermissions are long as well. You're basically waiting for the Panzer Mortar to return and for the fight to continue. I think it would have been way more fun if you used the environment of the town itself to damage the Panzer Mortar, knocking over the bell tower, using the torchlight trap, and the river nearby to defeat the boss. This would be more cinematic and take advantage of the map, but I guess that would leave it unplayable. Although I will admit, the way he is actually defeated is quite creative and uses a property of the batteries already expressed in the map previously. The fight has some fun ideas, but it's bogged down by a slow, repetitive process, and intermissions with the brevity of a snail. As for the risk of going down, the fight has a permanent armor station, and I was able to beat the fight without going down on my first try, by simply playing it safe. Going below the odds boss fight. Sometimes length doesn't always mean quality. In The Darkest Shore, players encounter a different kind of boss fight. Forged from the strength of the Electro Schnell and Straub's master assassins, the Meistermeuchlers are a deadly monster who use the specialist abilities against you. The purple Meuchler buffs undead like how Frontline increases your damage. The green one blinds you, making the Meuchler nearly invisible like the player's use of camouflage. The yellow one fires deadly saw blades that can take one entire piece of armor out if they make contact with you. This relates to Free Fire somehow. And the red Meuchler produces a stunning blast like the player's use of Shell Shock. The boss fight requires you to think on your feet and is constantly evolving with each phase, with phase 1 taking place on the beach, with one Meuchler spawning in at a time. The second phase takes place in the U-boat room and with 2 Meuchlers, the third taking place on top of the mountain with 3, and at the final phase takes place back on the beach with all 4 spawning at once. These bosses by themselves are extremely deadly, and with small arena spaces and undead thrown into the mix, you better put them down quickly should the situation get out of hand. Especially in phase 2, where you don't get an armor refill and flames are constantly spewing out of the ground. What's even cooler is the thematics. At the end of the main quest, our characters call in an air raid to destroy the island they are currently on, in the hopes of destroying Straub's army and preventing it from taking over the world. But what's cool is that if you take too long in the fight against the Meuchlers, you actually end up being attacked by the bombs coming from the air raids, which is a neat touch. The fog is used really well here too, although the Meuchlers still do way too much damage for their own good. It's a fight that will have you emerge victorious by the skin of your teeth, or completely annihilated if you aren't properly set up. Then there's the zombies themselves. You could have easily made the fight devoid of them, and it would have been massively improved. They don't pair all too well with the multiple bosses, and enemies like the Wusslings are just unnecessary, especially when you consider what's already coming at you from the fog. This fight is nigh impossible in solo, unless you run a specific strategy that uses the sniper rifle, the Delisle, which gains a powerful AoE headshot mine that nearly decimates the Meuchlers before they even have a chance to attack you, which is what you're seeing right now. Before I learned this strategy, I was lucky I was even able to originally beat the fight in solo, much less while still using my quick revive and the 2 self revives. But with some proper planning, the fight is possible solo without going down, as you can see here, but arguably one of the toughest on the list, and this took me hours of practice to learn. Going below the alien graves from Spaceland, some balancing would have gone a long way. The Shadowed Throne is a multifaceted boss fight with some great spectacle, but has too many issues that prevent it from being something truly great. In their third experience, our characters actually defeat their main antagonist, Dr. Peter Straub, something I didn't think that they'd actually do. It's a great plot twist. When escaping the floating weapon he calls home, our characters are ambushed by his final creation, the Stadjäger, an overcharged, mutilated monster who could take down an entire army if left to its own devices. The fight has some absolutely killer thematics, and unlike many of the boss fights previously talked about, this one has a building overture that grows as you progress through the fight, which is really cool. And just the way the team builds the environment for this fight truly sets it apart. Then there's the fight itself. The Stadjäger can only be damaged during attacks it performs, and unlike what I said in my World War II review, you actually do receive hit markers when damaging the beast by looking at the flaring engines on his chest. In the first phase, the Stadjäger can only be damaged when he's rushing towards players. This attack is easy to avoid and allows you to stack up some damage rather quickly. Once enough damage is done, he'll overload himself with a Geistbolt. This causes the fight to move on to phase 2, where he can now only be damaged when he's creating Gekoks. Granted, in phase 2, he can still rush at players, but any damage applied won't count towards damaging him, which slows the fight down, as now you can only attack him at specific times. Once enough damage is applied again, you can move on to phase 3. The Stadjäger will now overload himself once more and begin producing gas clouds. When in these clouds, players must use the Wunderbuss to damage him. This is especially difficult as he will continue to cycle through the 2 previous attacks, where he is invulnerable while he does them. All of this is fine and dandy, but by watching the footage in the background, you can probably glean 2 things. The Stadjäger is tanky, and you are constantly being swarmed with the full might of Straub's undead army. The undead here poorly synergize with the cramped nature of the Zeppelin, and because the game pulls from the natural round pool, the undead will only grow in numbers and in strength. This also applies to your ammo situation, with the only max ammos being gifted to players being the ones awarded to you every 5 rounds. And honestly, you'll be lucky if the undead even drop power-ups, much less an additional max ammo. This fight would be perfect if it was just the boss and a small pool of about 6 to 12 zombies at a time. But in its current state, the overwhelming numbers make this an arduous fight, and much like the Stadjäger himself, agonizing torture. I really like this boss fight, but in solo, it's a nightmare that requires meticulous skill. Going above the Rat King, as it's pure zombie killing, but below the Meister Meuchlers for poorly integrating the undead in the worst way imaginable. At least in the Meuchler fight, you have access to guaranteed max ammos in between phases, and an armor station in phase 3, which easily carries you through the rest of the fight. Whereas in Shadowed Throne, if you don't bring the Dancer's Dagger, you have no way to restore your armor outside of special mods. What a mess. I had to constantly re-record this fight as I was being killed by seemingly dumb mistakes. Alright, so let's talk about the Tortured Path. While these aren't quest-based boss fights, like Oz from Descent, we're still going to include them. There's 3 bosses here, so we'll talk about each of them separately. In the first chapter of the Tortured Path, players must face down an empowered Brenner titled the Rackenbrenner. The boss fight is nothing more than a repeated encounter with the Brenner from the Final Reich, with an increased health bar. The Brenner does nothing more than act like a Panzer without a retractable claw. No, seriously, the Brenner uses animations and rigging references from the BO3 Panzer. Fun fact. To defeat the Rackenbrenner, you must lead him into an airstrike blast, which disables his shield. This can be done by throwing a monkey and absolutely laying into him with a packed M1A1 with Frontline. It's an extremely short fight with almost nothing to show for it content-wise, besides just being an obligatory boss fight. Super quick, and I probably repeated the footage twice just for the segment. Going above the cryptids, but is boring really much better than just bad? In Chapter 2, Across the Sea, this boss fight has a re-encounter with the Stadjäger. But unlike the Rackenbrenner, which includes the gimmick of the shield bubble needing to be destroyed, this time, players must simply fight an extremely weak Stadjäger, with the fight stopping at 2/3 and 1/3 health to initiate a phase change. But the boss is literally destroyed before it can do anything. Even worse than the Rackenbrenner, not much I can say that I didn't say for the original Stadjäger fight. Going below the Rackenbrenner, but above the cryptids. Here we go, an actual unique boss fight. The Guardian is the final fight in the Tortured Path, and takes place at the end of Chapter 3, Beneath the Ice. The Guardian is a tanky foe who uses gravitational wells to pull you in, deals a large amount of damage with his melee attacks, and can refill his health by consuming blood in the map center. If properly stopped, the boss will become stunned and a large amount of damage can be dealt to him. This process is repeated until he's defeated. Sadly, despite its more unique qualities, the boss fight is rather boring, with the entirety of the tortured path having poor thematics and no unique music, with the Guardian being the only standout. Going up with a Panzer Mortar for knowing when it's time to be over, but below Oz for having a worse build-up and conclusion. In the final map in World War II Zombies, we're forced to face off with a revived Thulian god known as the God King. The God King is personally one of my least favorite fights in the series next to the Cryptids. It's long, drawn out, and a mix between unfair and flat out just not being fun. But let's get into the fight. The first phase is probably my least favorite one, with the God King continually attacking you with stray beams of Geistcraft. A direct hit can instantly defeat an entire armor plate, which is stupid, and you'll have to constantly refill your armor using the Thulian Flail, which slows down the fight. His attacks include the aforementioned Blast of Geistcraft, launching a barrage of Geistcraft bombs, and being completely invulnerable when he's moving, making it hard to land hits on him. The second phase is activated once you down the God King, where he gains the ability to unleash the power of the sun. This can be negated by hiding behind a shield or hiding behind an ice pillar. The third stage involves granting immunity barriers to the undead, while the God King travels around the four corners of the map. And the final phase in solo has him summoning a firewall that must be teleported through with the flail to damage him. Seems like an easy fight on paper, but the problem comes in how tanky he is and how long the phases last. This fight's not even that interesting. It's simply ducking and weaving between ice pillars and around the arena, and getting in pot shots whenever you can. The fight in solo takes around 12 to 15 minutes. And it's just this, for 12 to 15 minutes. Long, agonizing, and not even fun in the slightest, the God King is the type of boss you'd think Mephistopheles would be. But while Mephistopheles runs for about the same time frame, the fight intermixes various intermediary phases, numerous attacks, and easy to mark tells that make you, the player, feel rewarded for learning the fight. But the monotony of the God King fight makes him a boring final boss, to the point where you might as well just do the cheese strategy, which is infinitely more satisfying. Then there's the thematics, and unlike the beautiful art direction World War II usually goes with, the God King's chamber is an over-exaggerated, lame-looking blood-soaked dome that loses all of the nuance the art direction usually has. Personally, the boss fight ranked the lowest, but objectively I'm putting it below the Rat King, but above Oz. It's multifaceted, and nearly all of his attacks and counters are taught to you when you build the wonder weapons. But it's a boring fight that I've just never gotten any enjoyment out of. Way too difficult to beat without going down, and it's just more fun to use the scythe and cheese him. Black Ops 4. One of my favorite entries in the franchise, with the boss fights not disappointing, easily being some of the series' best. They're fun, well thought out, and actively take advantage of the various tools players have at their disposal, while not being overly difficult due to defensive options like the shield, specialist weapons, and undead overall attacking slower than their previous counterparts. In the first boss fight for Treyarch since the Shadow Man from Revelations, Voyage's Eye of Odin has a ton to live up to, and honestly, I think it delivers. The Chaos Crew faced off against an eldritch deity known as the Nidhogg, taking the form of the impaled Eye of Odin. Now with no way out, they must fight to survive. The Eye of Odin is a multi-phased boss fight that goes on too long for its own good. But let's talk about it. The first two phases of the Eye of Odin boss fight don't actually have you take on the Eye itself. Instead, you'll need to defeat Stokers and Blightfathers to move on, all while surrounded by the undead. This can be quite boring, even though you're slowly introduced to the abilities that the Eye has, like summoning ice storms that empower regular zombies in mass, similar to the water zombie buff. Phase 3 is where the Eye truly begins to go on the assault, allowing you to attack it while it fires ice beams at you, with phases 3 and 4 playing out quite similarly, but in different locations. And during the final phase, the Eye will gain a screen nuke attack once it has been dealt enough damage. What's cool is that unlike the screen nuke attack from DE, the Chaos Crew all have unique quotes that warn players of the incoming deadly finisher, and the eye has a loud sound effect that you simply can't ignore while charging in a way that indicates to players that you have to take it down now or die trying. If you successfully prevent this attack, you'll progress the fight, but if you fail, the eye will instantly down you and you'll have to reapply the damage that you just dealt. But what makes the fight work is the multi-layered way that you switch between attacking the undead and the eye. The eye's main attack does middling damage and freezes players if they come into contact with it for too much damage, allowing the undead to pick you off. Personally, for the fast-paced and high-damage gameplay of Black Ops 4, the undead synergize perfectly with the boss and his lane-based attacks, making them satisfying to take down, but the boss itself isn't too overbearing, unlike one as lethal as Mephistopheles or the God King. But what really sells the boss fight for me is the thematics and the way the boss uses the play space of the Titanic. The music is one of my favorite tracks in the series, and the way it continually builds with each phase, leading to a crescendo in the final phase, is nothing short of beautiful. And so far, one of the best themes we've discussed thus far. Then there's the way the environment changes the further the fight goes on, with snow and ice being applied all over the place, with a specific case being shown off during phase 3 in the hallways. There's also the way the ship rocks in between phases, and the fact that in phase 2, the water that can be seen in between pieces of the ship is completely frozen. And who could forget the beautiful pipe that falls in phase 4. I love all of these details, and it's one of the few times it feels as though the story is able to interact with Titanic as a zombies map and not just a piece of history. Easily one of my favorite boss fights in the series, from its tone, to its gameplay, to the way the developers handcrafted nearly every moment of it. Now, if there were some criticisms I'd have to give, it'd be how long the fight goes on for, and how few map mechanics the fight incorporates. But honestly, this fight is so cool, and I hardly even think about those factors as it takes full advantage of how powerful you'd be, with the fight perfectly synergizing with the BO4 gameplay loop. Sadly, it's hard for me personally to rank how difficult this fight would be to do solo without going down, because I've done it so many times over the years. For most players, this fight is a challenge, but for me, it's just another fun boss fight with the eye. Going above Gorod's Dragon and Nikolai fight, but below Mephistopheles. Coming up next is 9's Fury and Wrath. Coming at the end of the 9 Easter egg, Fury and Wrath are more of a spectacle than an actual boss fight for most players. But if you ask me, the fight is a ton of fun and is actually kind of difficult for solo players, especially if you don't keep your distance. Taking place after a large rush of gladiators, the Helephants sport powerful armor and attempt to attack players using their large size and strength to take them down. Alongside this, players are also attacked by various gladiators that periodically chuck flaming spears at them. Once the armor is destroyed, the riders are thrown off, and the Helephants gain the ability to launch blasts of prima materia and produce flame pillars from the ground that damage you over time. And then there's the possibility the boss will simply launch you into the air and kill you by the means of gravity. And then there's the undead themselves. Due to their massive size of the arena to support the elephants, the undead are hardly a big deal and barely feel as though they're even there sometimes. And who could forget the music, which fully immerses you in the environment and world, especially with the cultists cheering you on. Although, it's a shame both elephants encounter and fight players in the exact same way, so once you've defeated Fury, you already know how the second one's going to play out. The riders chucking their flaming spears can lead to an early down, but if you destroy the armor quickly with the shield, you'll pretty much be in the clear. Going below the Keeper from DE, but still one of the best the game has to offer. Blood of the Dead's main quest feels as though it's building towards a climactic showdown with the Warden. On paper, this should be an epic conclusion to a lengthy main quest, but in practice, the boss fight of Blood is lackluster and underwhelming. After entering the fight, players are forced to take on Wardens, Hellhounds, and standard undead. What feels like an intermediary phase in any other boss fight becomes the entire fight in Blood, with this being the meat and potatoes of what players are supposed to do. Once enough have been defeated, you must stun the Warden by destroying the apothecary orbs he summons and overload the machine with the power of the shield blast. What makes this segment cool is that if you don't destroy the orbs in time, the Warden will actually take the machine, turning it orange. And it's also cool to see the Warden use apothecary powers and speak in said language. Perform this ritual twice, and Richtofen must hop into the machine, de-thawing a previous version of himself. With the Master Fire Crystal in hand, he disables the barrier of the Super Warden, now chasing players in the arena, and all it takes is one use of the Magma Gat, and the boss fight is over before you know it. Blood of the Dead's boss fight has some good thematics, and the use of the Apothicon symbols as attacks like the ones used in Shadows of Evil's main quest is a good touch. But the fight hardly lives up to the expectation the main quest sets up, and feels like the map goes out with a whimper when it should have gone out with a bang. And then there's the undead, which, yeah, they just kind of exist. They hardly have any synergy with the Warden, and the fight is so short, it's over before you know it. While not a terrible fight, it leaves much to be desired, especially after the map's main quest, and is why its ranking as low as it is. Extremely easy for any solo player to beat, and you'll be done in less than 5 minutes. Going below the Guardian, but above the Panzer Mortar. The Shadow Werewolf, or as I like to call it, the Wendigo Werewolf, is a chaotic beast summoned at the end of the Dead of the Night Easter egg. To defeat this boss, players have to align statues around the arena to reveal a cage that unveils the boss and allows it to be damaged. The boss fight doesn't exactly attack players a whole lot, and it'll constantly rush up and down the arena, trying to damage you in straight lines. This is easily avoidable if you just stay towards the outer rings of the arena. The boss can also misalign the statues, needing them all to be reactivated. Once enough damage is dealt, you'll have to go through an intermediary phase where you battle more undead, Nosferatus, and werewolves. Then phase 2 begins, and you'll pretty much just have to repeat what you did in phase 1. An extremely simple boss fight that makes up for it with some good undead synergy, beautiful thematics, and a good main theme that can become slightly repetitive. You'll probably be able to make it out without going down, and setting up for this fight is as easy as upgrading a Spitfire. Going below the Mortulars but above Krogzilla. The thematics truly save this one from just being boring.
And thus Cain slew Abel, and the mark was set upon him.
Taking place at the top of Mount Olympus, the Chaos Crew must stop the demigod known as Perseus to free the Oracle and locate Scarlet's father, Alistair Rhodes. The boss fight is split between 2 phases, with Pegasus taking up the fight's first half. The flying horse can block off lanes with lines of lightning, and moves at a high speed, making the target hard to hit if you don't use the gauntlets, which have a really cool effect when the shots trace Pegasus as she goes underneath the arena. Once down, Pegasus will glow with a golden ichor, signifying that she can now only be damaged by specialist weapons, which is an idea introduced to players when they open a Pack-a-Punch, which is a really cool use of the in-map mechanics and ludo-narrative of the specialist weapons. What's really cool is that to aid in the recharge of your specialist weapons, the flaming pool of fire Perseus shoots at you actually refills your specialist over time, which creates a fun dichotomy between recharge and health. As Pegasus is damaged, the farthest island will be destroyed by Perseus, and once Pegasus is defeated, Perseus will then consume her energy and destroy the second island. This will lead to some of the coolest sets of animations and thematics in the entire series.
No, I am Lord of Olympus! At least that poor horse is free now. The gods are not...
Now all on his own, Perseus will drop down to players and attack them with the might of Prima Materia. If hit by a direct swing of his blade, you'll be instantly downed. Keep your distance, and once successfully pinned, Perseus can now be defeated by the power of your specialist weapons. What's also nice is how low the zombie numbers are, almost like what I said Shadow Thrones fight should have done. Short and sweet, with some of the best thematics in the series, untold scale, and a true completion of a vision that ends the Chaos storyline off on a high note. Difficult if you attempt it unprepared, but one of the best in the series. This fight can be troublesome to complete in solo, with the Pegasus phase being partially difficult as she sections off parts of the arena with her attacks. Going below the Eye of Odin, but above Gorod's Nikolai and Dragon fight. And how could I forget the music?
No, this cannot be! I am the son of Zeus! Was it worth it, culero? Of course.
Being the only boss fight the Ultimus crew faced off against, the Avogadro from Alpha Omega makes for a perfect boss fight for our age-old crew. The Avogadro is a deadly foe forged from the powers of the Elemental Shard, and America's attempts to recapture the magic of the MPD with the APD. Encountered in an attempt to retrieve the shard, players must repower the APD and just simply send the problem away. What makes this fight unique is that the boss cannot actually be damaged by any traditional means, which makes the Avogadro an infinitely more engaging version of the Panzer Mortar from World War II. Actually, now that I think about it, even like when he kneels, the Avogadro has the exact same animation as the Panzer Mortar. In solo, this fight is perfectly balanced, and just like the Spaceland Alien Greys, the fight has a fencing-style gameplay loop where players must defensively avoid attacks the Avogadro uses while trying to take down the undead that constantly swarm you and fill up the soul jars. Just like Ancient Evil, this fight is also properly paced by having a low density of undead attack the player, giving you time to pay attention to the boss without being completely overwhelmed. But if you stop paying attention to them, they can be the difference between avoiding and taking it down. The Avogadro can temporarily disable player weapons with an EMP blast, which I have no idea how that works, fire a quick shot of lightning that can two-shot players, and when charged and ready, rush down the lane and attempt to instantly down them. This can be avoided by keeping your distance, listening to audio cues, listening for character quotes that alert the player, and by using your specialist weapon, which gives you more than enough health to survive the blow. I love this boss fight, and who can forget the track used, titled after the titular boss? Easily one of the best themes in the series. If there was any criticism, it would have to be that the boss is broken down into 4 soul boxes, which isn't all that exciting when you really think about it like that. This fight isn't too difficult for a solo player, but if you aren't locked in, it'll be very easy to go down. Going above the Super Slasher but below the Dragon and Nikolai, one of Alpha Omega's few highlights.
Facility transport via pyramid.
Cold War Zombies. What an amazing Zombies entry. For the first time since Carrier, Tog der Toten and Die Machina would not feature explicit boss fights, as Tog is a moving soul box with no primary antagonist, and Die Machina is a defense mission with, again, no primary antagonist, as the Mayak is simply a megaton and isn't a consistent threat. The Orda is a fleshy dark ether undead amalgamation that attempts to stop players from escaping the base with Samantha Maxis. It can slam down its giant fist, shoot out hellhounds, summon reinforcements, and produce fiery wisps that reveal a weak point when being shot at. Orda would be a threat if it actually moved around the arena, but due to being stuck on the ground and the high firepower of Cold War weapons, the boss fight is over in less than a minute, with the background footage probably already being repeated by now. There's not much to say, and that's why it's ranking so low. Cold War boss fights are arguably pretty easy, and Orda is no different. Very little style and very little substance, going below the Panzer Mortar but above the Thrasher King. Being the first of 2 Outbreak Easter eggs, Legion is often considered one of Cold War's most difficult boss fights. From the wide area of effects of his attacks, to the onslaught of enemies, to even the timer playing a role in all of this, it's quite easy to take an unintentional down. Legion only has 3 attacks. He can summon large Dark Ether storms that lock off various parts of the arena, summon a flurry of Dark Ether crystals that apply extremely light damage, and at specific times will unleash a large blast of energy that can instantly down players if caught in the blast. But what helps is the immediate visual and audio indicators such as a large charge up time, and the circles on the ground telling players where it'll end up. Then there's the enemies. Legion has players face off against the Megaton, the Krasny Soldat, Hellhounds, Plaguehounds, Manglers, and Barguas. All of these enemies combined can make the fight a nightmare, but each of these foes can be overpowered by the numerous systems players have at their fingertips, and it helps how big the arena is. While the thematics might be weak, the gameplay more than makes up for it. To defeat Legion, players must destroy its armor and defeat the 3 orbs that pop out of the beast's chest. The fight is exhilarating, and if anything, the timer adds more life to the fight than you'd think, despite it really not mattering in the grand scheme of things. Taking full advantage of the power players have, Legion is a fun boss fight that perfectly challenges the gameplay of Cold War. This fight can be tricky for solo players, and especially those trying not to go down. But if you bring a long-range weapon with you, use Aether Shroud, and take your time, the fight's pretty easy. Going below the Avogadro, but above the Super Slasher from Rave.
The killing blow! The
Crystals are destroyed! Hoorah! Hatch is clear for missile launch.
Sadly, the second Outbreak Easter egg isn't as nuanced or as creative as Legion. In Operation Excision, the strike team is lured into a trap and must defeat a horde of the undead and Orda to escape. There's not much to say here, as the fight pits you against the Outbreak version of Orda, and any standard undead that usually show up during an exfil sequence. Now granted, if there's any positives I wanted to give this encounter, are the changes made to Orda to make him work in the Outbreak setting, which is commendable. Sadly, there's not much going on here, besides the helicopter slowly approaching and illuminating the area. And there's no unique track playing either. There's not much to say here, besides I understand them saving time and resources, but there's really nothing else to say. Going below the Shadow Man for reusing the boss concept, but above the Tortured Path boss fights for lasting more than 30 seconds.
Requiem belongs to me now.
Going from one of the most underwhelming fights in the series, we have one of my personal favorites. In Mauer der Toten, the strike team are confronted by Valentina as the Forsaken and his army slowly approach the portal and begin their conquest of Earth. Valentina is a multi-phased and multifaceted encounter that takes place all over the map of Mauer. Valentina has multiple abilities and attacks. She can summon a barrier that must be destroyed before damage can be applied to her. She summons yellow crystals that can tear away your armor, produce a screen nuke that must be avoided by hiding behind the terrain, summon tormentors to defend her, and raise a small horde of the undead to recover health from. This fight constantly has players on their toes, as well as some cool thematics. Just like the Avogadro, the fight has some killer music to go alongside it, with the OST giving the fight so much life, especially as the tune grows and evolves, much like Voyage's boss fight theme. It also helps the undead perfectly synergize with the fight. Alongside Valentina comes Krasny Soldats and Disciples, which are both easily dispatched with the power of Cerberus. Putting all these factors together, and you've got a recipe for one of the best fights in the series. Valentina can be difficult for solo players, but always being able to grab armor in between phases makes it pretty easy. While I believe Pegasus and Perseus are better in terms of overall spectacle, Valentina has much better gameplay integration, and the fight is an iconic part of Cold War.
No! It is not possible! I was chosen! It was foretold!
In Cold War's grand finale, the strike team must take down Zykov, the Forsaken, before he begins his global conquest and destroys the world. To defeat this foe, players must charge Samantha with the power of the undead, and fire laser cannons left there by Omega to defeat the Forsaken and save everything. This fight has some seemingly good spectacle, but in execution it's rather boring, and that's even if you ignore how powerful the Crystal Axe is. The Forsaken can summon ice storms to slow you down, electric orbs that chase players around the arena, slam down on the ground and summon shockwaves, and produce a large laser beam from his mouth, and create a portal that allows undead to pour into the arena. Undead enemies include Barguas, Manglers, Disciples, Tormentors, Abominations, and even a Krasny Soldat. But all of these are completely trivialized by the Wonder Weapon. Personally, this fight is a lot of fun, and I love the spectacle and pacing of the fight. Things are fast paced, and the fight moves with purpose. And I love the way the body parts of the Forsaken are changed when they're destroyed, the variety of enemies, the interactions with Samantha, and the ending perfectly concludes the encounter. Maybe this fight shouldn't be as high as I'm going to rank it, but it's personally one of my favorites. The Forsaken also has players take a forced narrative down, but we're going to ignore that for the sake of this video. And it doesn't help that the Forsaken is nothing more than a large purple wall. Going below the alien greys, but above the Meistermeuchlers. Shinonuma Reborn is the first Vanguard Zombies boss fight. The Allied forces have come across the Shinonuma facility and must now restore the memories of Syraxis to find a way to defeat Cortifex. Along the way, they come across her memories, but although they've taken a new form, known as the Echo. To defeat the Echo, players must defeat specific undead with the Wunderwaffe to weaken her aura, allowing you to do damage. This fight intermixes undead, tormentors, and stormkriegers, but none of them do a whole lot of damage, and the fight has a sluggish pace. And it also doesn't help that the Echo just uses the same attacks as Zavala, which is kind of lame. The fight takes place in the Pack-a-Punch dig site, and it's over in just a few minutes. Hardly even a boss fight with a dynamic enemy. Going just above the reused Torture Path bosses, but below the Orda X from Outbreak. There's really not a whole lot to say. And now for the second and final map in Vanguard Zombies, players are able to face off against Cortifex the Deathless, a Dark Ether entity who attempts to become the supreme ruler of the Dark Ether. To defeat Cortifex, players have to shoot out one of his eyes. The fight stretches between 3 phases, and was touted as being where most of the development time for the experience went. I like Cortifex's animations, and it's cool they fully designed and modeled him, but the fight is not Mephistopheles. Cortifex can launch demonic orbs at you that follow your position, summon a flurry of powerful lightning bolts, and during phases 2 and 3, these attacks are upgraded, and he gains a shield which must be destroyed by sending rocks into the construct. These rocks are activated by upgrading Dark Ether crystals in special Dark Ether plants, and throwing those blue rocks into the floating Dark Ether structures. I swear to God, man, this game. The crystals are hard to shoot, the boss is surprisingly tanky, and the gimmicks feel just kinda boring. The fight's main appeal is its spectacle, but unlike the Forsaken, Cortifex somehow does even less. It's not a bad fight, but it can be rather boring. In solo, this fight can take you down if you're not careful, and take too long to finish it. But with the power of the EX1 and Ring of Fire, the fight is over rather quickly, with the undead hardly even getting a chance to help their Supreme Overlord. Going above Oz for having some cool animations, but below the God King for simply having 2 actual attacks. Was expecting a lot more. Now we're in the home stretch. MWZ is a game built to hop reckless and chaotic gameplay. Attempting to complete missions and boss fights without going down is considered unreasonable by this game standards, and everything is mostly built around the co-op experience. So how do I fare against the 3 worms? Well, let's talk about it. Orcus is fought at the end of the MWZ's main storyline. The Act 3 mission is a constantly building event, and the worm feels like a natural conclusion to all the different story and gameplay beats presented in the mission. Orcus can produce an insta-kill laser in patterns of 2 at a time, shoot out swarms of locusts much like Orda, slam down on the ground if you stay too close, eat you if you're perfectly within its range, slam down on the ground with its whole body in a line, and burrow underground and eat you from below, causing fatal damage if you're spit out and you don't deploy your parachute in time. The worms were my nightmare, specifically Greylorm, but we'll get to that in a moment. They're fun fights, but every attack has Mephistopheles' level of lethality to them, making them a nightmare to get for this video, especially in solo, because it's hard to hit the weak points as the worm is always facing towards you, and the weak points are on their sides. Orcus isn't exactly all too difficult of a fight, especially with how big the weak spots are, a grace not given to us in subsequent fights. And due to all the ammo boxes laying around the arena, you'll be done in no time, especially if you play aggressively. A difficult fight, but not an impossible one, as long as you keep refilling your armor. Going below the Forsaken for not exactly having any unique themings, but above the Mortualers for offering a balanced challenge that perfectly caps the first 3 acts of MWZ. Sadly, MWZ continues its storyline with Act 4. The quality of the gameplay remains the same, but the worst part of this sequence is the Act 4 boss fight with Gormgant. Gormgant is a near identical boss fight to the Act 3 Orcus fight, with a slight increase in difficulty. The worm's fight moves a bit faster, its weak points are smaller, and it has an increased health pool, making the fight harder than before. But at the end of the day, the boss fight plays out nearly identical to the Act 3 fight, besides just taking place in a smaller arena, with 1 ammo box available, and in the Dark Ether. There's really not much to say about the fight, besides it just being a repeat of the Act 3 fight. Going below the Thrasher King for just being a repeated boss fight, with hardly any distinct changes. If you fought Orcus, then you fought Gormgant. Now granted, if there's any silver lining, it's that Gormgant can be fought at any time in the player's experience, whereas Orcus appears after 20 hours of MWZ story missions. Now hopefully we're going to talk about the final worm, Greylorm. To fight Greylorm, players have to scour the entire MWZ map and collect 4 thumb drives. By locating the boss arena and waiting for the Aether Storm to show up, players can summon Greylorm by inserting the thumb drives into seismic devices. The fight takes place completely within the storm, thus forcing players to maintain a healthy gas mask by always returning to one of the 2 ammo boxes. And thus, if the mask breaks, there's very little chance that you'll survive. Greylorm has many of the same attacks, but on top of what players already have to deal with, there are endless hordes of the undead chasing you, constantly chipping away your armor, alongside the locust-like orbs that will always be swarming around you. This is an intense fight, and honestly, it's one of my favorites. There's a ton of skill involved, numerous factors to be considered, and much like Mephistopheles, it properly challenges players in the best way imaginable. But going for a downless run is another story. Many of Greylorm's attacks will instantly break your armor, or down you if you have no armor left. If there's one silver lining, it's how you can abuse that tactic to your advantage. As long as you have armor, the next high damage attack will only finish off whatever armor remains. So in the Worm's case, which can deal upward of 250 damage per attack, so long as you refill one plate of your armor, you can typically survive just about any attack the Worm throws at you, making staying above 0 armor a top priority, on top of keeping your ammo and gas mask refilled. And on top of all of that, you have anywhere between 9 to 12 minutes to complete the fight. And in solo, that's barely enough time to defeat the boss, on top of keeping yourself alive, and on top of not dying to the storm. There were attempts where I would finish the fight with mere seconds to spare. Greylorm is what I love about zombies, until you consider 2 factors. One, you can't begin the boss fight until the storm arrives, so if you get set up early, you have to just sit there and do nothing, which is never fun. Then there's the acquisition system. To get properly set up, you'll need gold armor plates, the Aether Blade, the Scorcher, and a legendary Aether tool. None of these items you can naturally find on the map. If you lose the fight, or go down in my case, then you'll not only lose your items, you'll have to spend time regaining them like your backpack, armor, and upgraded gas mask. And on top of that, these schematics take 2 days to recharge, so you can't even retry the fight if you wanted to. What made something like Mephistopheles so much more doable was how easy it was to retry and practice the fight in boss fight mode. And for that, as much as I love the fight, it can't go anywhere near the top 10 because of it, going below Fury and Wrath from 9, but above the Spider Queen from Zetsubo. A fully realized encounter that grows with the scale with the amount of players who join the fight, which is really cool. One of the most difficult fights I had to accomplish for this video besides Mephistopheles and the God King. But to make all of that work null and void, 2 weeks after I beat the boss without going down after a month of attempts, the team at Treyarch updated the VR11 to deal much more damage to the worms. A lot more damage. And with that factor in mind, I attempted the boss fight and completed it without any difficulty. Wow, I love making videos like this sometimes. And that was my quest to complete every single boss fight in Zombies in solo without going down. Around 60% of these boss fights were extremely easy to do and required little to no effort, with most boss fights requiring you to complete them downless to even stand a chance at completing the egg anyways, like Gorod. Games like IW, World War II, and MWZ proved to be the most difficult, requiring me to spend the most time trying to complete them for the sake of this video. But if you come this far, then you probably just want to see my rankings, so let's go over them real quick. Coming in at the bottom is the Beast from Beyond's Cryptid Swarm. Number 35 is the Stadjäger from the Tortured Path. 34, the Rockenbrenner, also from the Tortured Path. Number 33, the Echo Syraxis from Shinonuma Reborn. Number 32, the Orda Exfil from Outbreak. Number 31, the Shadow Man from Shadows of Evil. Number 30, the Shadow Man from Revelations. Number 29, Gormgant from Operation Deadbolt. Number 28, the Thrasher King from Zetsubo no Shima. Number 27, Orda from Firebase Z. Number 26, the Panzer Mortar from the Final Reich. Number 25, the Warden from Blood of the Dead. Number 24, the Guardian from the Tortured Path. Number 23, Oz from Descent. Number 22, Cortifex from the Archon. Number 21, the God King from the Frozen Dawn. Number 20, the Rat King from Shaolin Shuffle. At number 19, there's the Stadjäger from the Shadow Throne. At 18 is Krogzilla from Attack of the Radioactive Thing. Number 17 is the Shadow Werewolf from Dead of the Night. At 16, the Meister Moitzlers from the Darkest Shore. Number 15 is Orcus from Operation Deadbolt. Number 14 is the Forsaken from Forsaken. Number 13 is the Alien Greys from Zombies in Spaceland. Number 12 is the Spider Queen from Setsubo no Shima. Number 11 is Greylorn from Operation Deadbolt. Number 10 is Fury and Wrath from 9. At number 9 is the Keeper from Dreisendrach. At number 8 is the Super Slasher from Rave in the Redwoods. Number 7 is Legion from Outbreak. Number 6 is the Avogadro from Alpha Omega. Number 5 is the Mother Dragon and Ultimus Nikolai from Gorbai Krovi. Number 4 is Pegasus and Perseus from Ancient Evil. Number 3 is Valentina from Maurer Toten. Number 2 is Mephistopheles from The Beast from Beyond. And finally, at number 1, there's the Eye of Odin from Voyage of Despair. Now, the Eye of Odin and the God King are the two placements I took some creative liberties with. The God King I personally wanted to put towards the bottom, but I found his objective qualities place him above what I personally thought. And Mephistopheles is a fight I think is objectively the best, but I just like the Eye of Odin more due to his replayability. But they're both so close, it can really go either way. But what are your thoughts on the boss fights in Zombies? Have you done them more than once? Have you even attempted them all? And what are some of your favorites? Let me know below. This project was a blast to work on, and I truly came out of the experience with an updated knowledge of every boss in the series, further expanding my expertise on this game mode. Thank you all for watching. And a quick shout out to Gravity, who made the artwork for the thumbnail. Go follow him, subscribe to him, watch his videos, he is an absolutely amazing guy. These projects take quite a lot of time to make, so why not consider subscribing so you'll be notified in 18 months when I upload my next long-form video. And if you like this video, how about watching some of my other long-form reviews of AW, World War II, Cold War, and enjoy my recently nearly completed re-review of Infinite Warfare Zombies. And with only one map left, the series is soon coming to a close. Thank you all for watching, and remember, keep on slaying.